Well, I'm not sure if you're talking about this around your kitchen table, but it has certainly come up around mine. The idea of Canada becoming part of the States. That's today on This is Manitoba. I'm Marcy Markusa. Thanks for being with our podcast. And let's dig into this. So we always on our podcast try to make sense of the news in Manitoba in 20 minutes or less. This is being talked about countrywide because it's all about one word: sovereignty. It is a word that has been coming up even more frequently since U.S. President-elect Donald Trump talked about using, quote, economic force to get Canada to become part of the States. Let's begin with hearing from him. This is part of what Trump had to say, musing about making Canada, as he put it, the 51st state.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada. But here's the problem with Canada. So many friends up there. I love the Canadian people. They're great. But we're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada.
So my next guest worries what Trump's threats could mean for Indigenous sovereignty. Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nation. She was born and raised in Penimutang First Nation here in Manitoba and joins us on the line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
What are you thinking listening to President-elect Trump here?
Well, I just have to say we were, as National Chief, found that very offensive and alarming statements recently made by President-elect about his desire to force Canada to become part of the United States of America through economic coercion or other means. As First Nations, we reject these outlandish, disrespectful statements regarding our ancestral and traditional territories. The borders dividing Canada and the United States traverse the ancestral lands and traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations. We have inhabited our lands and territories since time immemorial, long before any colonial borders were established. And, this is why First Nations need to be at the table with First Ministers next week when they discuss these issues. It's 2025, and there shouldn't be a Team Canada approach without First Nations fully included and at the table. And I know that Ottawa's in a particular time right now. I get that. But, we are people, we're tribes and nations with inherent and treaty rights treaty rights of self-determination as recognized and affirmed in both the United Nations and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have entered into several international treaties with the Crown in respect to the United Kingdom and other nations, and we have and hold constitutional recognition and protections for our inherent treaty and human rights. Many First Nations have fought as allies of the British Crown in conflicts with the United States, but First Nations also have a long history of sacrifice, fighting for the freedoms of other nations, including the United States, in 2 world wars, in other conflicts. First Nations, we retain and exercise our inherent sovereignty and self-determined rights. We will continue to fight, protect, and uphold our sacred, inherent, and inalienable rights as peoples, tribes, and nations. So First Nations, we are also an integral to economic development on our lands and territories, as is our free, prior, and informed consent, respecting any development or political decisions by others. And we will continue to work with the British Crown as treaty partners. We will work with Canada. I want to uplift Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau for being united on this issue as well.
If I may interject, I actually have the quotes here, Chief, of what they have said. So I was going to ask you what you made of the responses. So Justin Trudeau said, quote, "Not a snowball's chance in hell. Canada will become the 51st state." And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, said, quote, to Trump, "Canada will never be the 51st state," end quote. What would you say if you were to have Donald Trump's ear right now?
I would tell him, drop the 51st state bullshit and understand who your friends are. I think I would leave it at that.
What's at stake for First Nations if the president-elect Donald Trump actually decided to act out on his remarks if he took office?
Well, I think there's a lot at stake, and I think that they have to, as I say, recognize who their friends are. We've been longtime allies and friends. We've been long before these borders even existed. There was trading between, First Peoples and peoples that came here, and I just think, these is it to push off something else, and I don't know. It's so alarming. It's disheartening to hear that. And I think Canadians are, they're worried about that because we wonder what happens next if we don't talk about these things. And so it's so important as Canadians that we stand together as treaty partners, as inherent partners, that premiers and all political parties work together. I'm really glad that for once you seem to see the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party kind of being on the same messaging on this. I'm really glad to hear that. But at the same time, we also have First Nations people in this country that can't be left out of this important conversation. We're on each side of the border right across. We've got family and friends and allies, longtime allies over both sides of the medicine line that we have to work with. And I think, the president-elect to come to say such disparaging remarks is so hurtful, and
You
it
you
could take a long time to get back to where we were.
you mentioned the obviously been talking about treaty rights, water rights, but you also mentioned the border. How, in your view, do First Nations in Canada view the border between Canada and the U.S.?
Well, certainly we always want to, we want to move more freely between the border, of course. I know that there's the Jay Treaty, and I don't know if you've ever, your listeners have ever heard of that, but there is a Jay Treaty that, because of these borders being made that are not our borders, we were to move more freely through. And I know that there's been many progress to date, and we'll continue to push for progress on that. And at the same time, I think that trade is so important between both countries. And I think this rhetoric of one getting more than the other, I don't think that's correct. And I think that we have to have a serious look at that and have serious conversations. And I think that we have a lot of allies in the on the American side, and we will continue to meet with them as the Assembly First Nations. Of course, we've got allies and friends on that side of the border that are also appalled about these statements. And so I think, Americans and Canadians have been longtime friends, and it's disheartening to hear such alarming comments from the president-elect.
You raised obviously the fact that you don't have a seat at the First Minister's meeting, and these meetings that are taking place next week. The premiers are going to meet with Trudeau, of course, because of what's been happening. And so, to that end, what have you done, or where have you reached out to try to get that seat?
Well, I'll have to say with the First Minister's meetings, and I think that has to also change in our beautiful country, because I think every time we have First Minister's meetings, for instance, on healthcare, a couple of years ago, they had $60 billion to talk about to divvy up in this country on healthcare. And they have First Nations people the day before talk to us for a couple of hours. And well, we appreciate that, having our time with the premiers and the First Ministers. It's also kind of insulting because they're there talking about First Nations people in this country, and they're like, we'll talk to you at the little kiddie table the day before, and then we'll really get down to business, close the door, and have those discussions within. And I think that those formats have to change in this country.
Earlier, I just want to ask you a last question, Chief Woodhouse, because earlier in the program, Woodhouse Nepinak rather, we were talking to an analyst, Tom Schaller. He's in Washington, D.C., who was looking at Trump's comments, about the 51st state. And he was saying he largely believes their rhetoric, but on the other hand, he says the more interesting response will be to see what Canadians do with them. And so obviously we've read the responses from the leaders right now, the outgoing leader, the Liberals, our Prime Minister, and then also Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau. But he was sort of alluding to the fact that it's really he's interested to watch what Canadians will do with this, whether or not there will be sort of some part of the population that will be somehow on board with this. What is your view of that? Is that something that concerns you, or is that outside of your concerns?
I think if there's one thing that's united Canadians right now, I think it's this issue. It's this issue because it's somebody questioning who we are as a country, our history. We have a long history, even though it's not always an easy history. It's sometimes a dark history, but it is our history. And we do have relationships that have been here for a long time. And, between Indigenous peoples and the newcomers that have come to this beautiful country. And, we're trying to create this beautiful new country together. It's not always easy. It's not always bumpy. Neither is the United States. And, to have these, like I say, these alarming comments to question our sovereignty is just outrageous.
That is Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. One more thing before we leave this topic. I have been watching a lot of and listening to a lot of U.S. media on this. And if you have not, I'd encourage you to do that as well. It is very interesting to hear the U.S. media perspective on these comments about Canada becoming, quote unquote, the 51st state. Well, next, let's return to something that we've had ongoing on the podcast as we explore the various ways that this issue's been affecting Manitobans. I'm talking about the death of a man in the Health Sciences Centre emergency room department here in Winnipeg. There were about 100 people in the HSC's ER the morning that a middle-aged man died, January 7th. He was waiting for care. And while that is more than usual, HSC officials said that it's not uncommon for the waiting room to get overcrowded on chilly days, cold days. It is because when the temperatures drop, unhoused Winnipeggers turn to emergency rooms as an escape from the cold. Marion Willis is with St. Boniface Street Links. Now, she shared with CBC that she feels this points to a larger problem.
Hospitals have been expected to provide a service that normally is provided by shelter services, and that's not fair. It kind of puts the hospitals in a very challenging set of circumstances. There's very few options for people. Your only option, if you're not housed, is to make your way to Main Street Project, to 190 Disraeli, to Salvation Army, to these places where there's very large numbers of people at those shelters. They're often very chaotic. People consider them unsafe. I don't know whether they're safe or they're unsafe, but they tell us that they feel unsafe. So when, just like anybody else, everybody seeks safety. Safety is a primary, sort of first human need, basic need to be met. And so you go where you can find that. And for a lot of people during the winter, it's waiting rooms in Winnipeg Hospital.
So Winnipegger Al Wiebe has experienced homelessness. It's been 13 years, though, since he lived on the streets. But he advocates for others who are struggling the same that he once did. And he is still currently doing that and very much in touch with the population. And we have him with us next. Good morning, Al.
Good morning.
So this idea of people who are houseless looking to emergency rooms on cold days, is this something that's been going on for years in Winnipeg, in your view?
Yeah. The one problem is, and I was asked yesterday, are there enough warming shelters? Well, yes, there are, but not enough 24/7 warming shelters, and that's the big problem. We have Magnus Eliasson over on Langside, and we have Marion on St. Mary's that has extended hours, and there are one or two other 24/7, but Shalom has during really cold weather they have an emergency pop-up shelter, but very, very few 24/7. And where are people supposed to go?
I'm wondering whether or not, it may be premature to ask this question, but you were in studio actually last month because of the closure of, the library services. Right. Now, that wouldn't have been the Library Resource Center for people what a lot of unhoused people may have used. That wouldn't have been 24/7 either.
No, not at all.
But we were talking about the downtown geographic, though downtown HSC kind of into the West End.
There was nothing there.
So there's shelter-wise in this core area, there's nothing?
There's Magnus Eliasson on Langside, which is close to Portage Avenue, is a 24/7 drop-in. And there are others like West Central Women's Resource Center, but they're not 24/7. They are there during business hours type of thing. And where are people supposed to go? one thing that bothered me about this was a comment by the spokesperson at the hospital saying overcrowding was the problem. I don't think so. The problem is they didn't do their job in this case of diagnosing that person's triage.
So speaking to the person that died on Tuesday, you don't believe that overcrowding should
No.
be highlighted as an issue?
No, and also during the Sinclair probe, Sinclair investigation report, one of the things that was recommended, they started looking at it, but then they backed off on it, was to have a liaison or somebody, a social worker or somebody in the emergency rooms to just talk to people, right? And just see how things are going with them, how you're feeling and all that kind of thing.
To check in.
You check in and, also, sometimes because after 15 hours, people tend to get really agitated. But as we see, people get left behind and get unnoticed. And how after 8 hours, how does a person die?
We're going to a lot of those questions. The premier was here yesterday, and we were asking what questions he would like to see answered in the investigation into this. And that monitoring piece that you're quite right was supposed to be happening consistently is one of the things we raised. Is that happening?
But it was dismissed, I guess.
Or not.
Yeah.
I guess we'll find out.
We'll find out. Yeah.
But it's a critical question. I'm not sure if you have firsthand experience in understanding what it's like to be in an emergency room or go to a hospital for warmth when you're unhoused, and what that's like to be that person.
I actually did that when I was out there because I was sleeping in a car in the junkyard in the back lane, and I needed heat once in a while. I did actually do that, but I was one of those that was smart enough to not overstay my welcome, and stay for 2 or 3 hours and then leave. And before, and don't go to triage, right? Just walk in and hopefully you get by the security guard and don't have to go to triage. But many times I would go to triage, and then before my number came up, I would leave. Right, and this happens over and over again. And
you would have sought shelter there. Why? Does that refer back to what you said at the beginning? There was just not enough 24/7 safe spaces?
Well, not for me. I was 2 blocks down on McPhillips and William, so this is my closest spot. I never used any of the services per se. I was too proud to do that. But that was just for in the wintertime. It was a really cold winter. We had minus 68 wind chills during the winter 2010. I just used it for a warm space. But again, there's a perception about people who are homeless or look homeless. And when I went to get help because I was suicidal after 14 and a half months, I had no hope left. I was rejected 3 times in a row. I spent total of 60 hours in the emergency room at HSC, and it was rejected 3 times in a row, leading to a jump off the bridge simply because they did not diagnose me properly.
Rejected meaning what? They refused you care?
I was seen by a psych nurse who just did not take my story seriously. And again, I shouldn't be here today.
Why would someone go to an ER, just to widen this into that, instead of a shelter, despite the fact of the 24 hours? Why would they not choose Salvation Army, Salome Mission? Should they be able to make their way there?
A lot of people are afraid of shelters. That's one thing. And shelters are, if you don't live in the shelter, you don't have access to the shelter. And during the really cold spells, Salvation Army will open their lobby and things like this, but only for short periods of time. You cannot stay there. And I think that goes back to not having enough 24/7 shelters or warming spaces. And for a while there, the city opened up, other places, but they have not done that this year.
Dr. Sean Young, who's a CEO of Health Sciences Center, said at a news conference this week that the ER was being used, I'm just going to repeat this, by unhoused Winnipeggers to keep warm on this day on Tuesday. I'm wondering, though, I'm repeating it because I wonder, the question is, what do you make of that being shared with the public?
I think it's a negative, and again, it casts it's a disparaging remark about the homeless folks. But again,
if it's a fact, why could it be seen as a negative? Like, what concerns you about it?
Folks experiencing homelessness are always seen as a negative on society, and this is why I have to fight so hard for it. But also, it can be a good thing to bring awareness, to the issue that maybe we just simply don't have enough housing for folks. And for me, the end result is permanent housing. Right? It's not shelter space. I think we need to revamp policies at shelter space to allow folks in for longer periods of time. It just doesn't happen. Other than Shalom, who does an excellent job of. They have a pop-up now, and they create an extra 200 spaces, something like that, right?
Thank you very much, Al, for being here. I know the Premier also said next week he's going to make more announcements about, he alluded to, wouldn't give us details on wraparound services, housing. So we'll see if
that's easier said than done.
Yes.
I'm interested to see what he has to say.
We certainly all are. Yeah. And you and I will talk again
For sure.
and with community once we do know what the plans are. Such a tragic story all the way around.
It is.
Thank you very much for being here.
And thank you for having me on.
Really interesting to hear Al Wiebe there talking about not just speaking on behalf as an advocate for people living houseless, but his own experience as well in seeking the ER for shelter, for warmth. By the way, coming up in Winnipeg, Al is hosting a symposium that has to do with gathering people together with lived experience and leadership to talk about the issues of the populations of people who are living without houses and are living homeless on the streets of Winnipeg. So that's coming up in the spring of 2025. That brings us to the end of our podcast today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Marcy Markusa, and don't forget to like and share.